If someone told you that a single bullet could tear through a church during Sunday Mass, and yet a priest survived because a mysterious blue mantle wrapped around him, would you believe it? Stay with this story. It will challenge everything you think you know about miracles. Sunday mornings in East Los Angeles usually carried a restless rhythm, cars rumbling, dogs barking, the echo of life bouncing between old apartment blocks. But on this particular morning, inside street, Mary of Hope Parish, Timmy felt strangely weightless. The 9 a.m. bilingual Mass had reached the consecration, that fragile moment when every breath in the church seemed to bow before heaven. Parents drew their children close. The choir softened their voices until they became little more than a trembling whisper beneath the stained glass glow. Incense curled upward in thin silver ribbons. For a brief, suspended heartbeat, the world felt safe, untouched, holy. Then the first burst of automatic gunfire shattered the air. It didn't sound real at first, more like a string of fireworks exploding somewhere down the block. But the second burst came louder, sharper, unmistakably violent. People screamed, mothers threw themselves over their kids. Elderly parishioners dropped to the floor. The windows rattled so hard that dust fell from the rafters in thin gray clouds. Outside, unseen from the pews, two rival gangs, the Saints and the Reapers, were unloading bullets at each other right on the church steps, the sacred entrance where children usually played tag after Mass. Yet, in the center of the sanctuary, Father Gabriel Morales did not move. He stood tall at the altar, host raised high, eyes locked on the crucifix above him, as if pleading silently for the chaos to stop. Some shouted his name, begging him to get down. Others reached for him with trembling hands. But he remained upright, exposed, vulnerable, stubbornly certain that God's house could not be touched by the violence outside. Then it happened. A single gunshot, louder than every volley before it, tore through the wooden doors. The glass shattered, exploding inward in a glittering storm. A silver streak cut through the incense smoke, slicing the air straight toward Father Gabriel's chest. He didn't even have time to flinch. And yet, in the front pew, several people would later insist they saw something impossible in that split second. A flash of blue light, gentle but fierce, bursting outward like a protective mantle. Some swore it looked like the flowing robe of the Virgin Mary, sweeping forward to shield the priest. A woman said the stained glass image of Mary seemed to glow brighter. A teenage boy claimed it looked as if a veil of light wrapped around Father Gabriel just before he fell. The bullet struck. The priest collapsed. The host slipped from his hands and drifted toward the altar cloth. And for one breathless, impossible moment, the entire church froze, unable to understand whether they had just witnessed a tragedy or the first spark of a miracle. Long before the bullet tore through the doors of street, Mary of Hope, long before the blue flash that half the congregation whispered about, Father Gabriel Morales had built a reputation that both inspired and unsettled people. His courage, unyielding, immovable, almost defiant, was the kind that made some parishioners feel safe, and others quietly fear that one day it would lead him straight into disaster. Gabriel had grown up just a few blocks from the very church he now led. East Los Angeles wasn't gentle with its children. He learned to distinguish the crack of gunfire from the pop of fireworks before he could even write his name. On hot summer nights, when other kids chased ice cream trucks, Gabriel sat on the front steps of a cramped apartment with his mother, watching police lights flash across the neighborhood like restless ghosts. His father, a construction worker from Jalisco, used to tell Mijo, "Fear is how the streets control you. Don't ever let it." And Gabriel didn't, not even once. As a teenager, he ran toward trouble instead of away from it, breaking up fights behind school dumpsters, escorting younger kids past gang corners, stepping between angry men twice his size. Adults called him brave. His friends called him crazy. But Gabriel learned to love the way courage felt, like armor no bullet could pierce. It was that same armor that eventually led him to the priesthood. Seminary professors admired his discipline. Parish leaders admired his fire. And when he was ordained at 29, people whispered that East LA had finally found the shepherd strong enough to stand his ground in a neighborhood that had lost too many good men. But courage, when overfed, has a way of mutating. And Gabriel's courage slowly hardened into something more dangerous. By his mid-30s, as pastor of Street Mary of Hope Parish, He had embraced a motto that sounded holy on the surface but hid a sharper edge beneath. A shepherd never retreats. When gang violence escalated after sunset, nearby parishes shortened their evening masses. Gabriel lengthened his. When the diocese suggested security protocols, he waved them off as fear disguised as wisdom. When young mothers asked whether the church could install cameras or screened entrances, he smiled gently but dismissed their worry. And whenever someone dared to question his choices, his answer was always the same. If I show fear, they will fear. My job is to stand. Most parishioners admired it. A few even idolized him. They loved the image of the unbreakable priest, the man who stayed calm through sirens, arguments, threats sprayed on brick walls, even the occasional gang member slipping into the back pew during confession hours. But there were others, especially the elders who had lost sons and nephews to street violence, who looked at Gabriel with quiet concern. They had lived long enough to know that bravery without humility wasn't strength. It was a storm waiting for a spark. Even Lucia, his younger sister who worked long nights in the ER, sensed it. She saw more blood on Friday nights than Gabriel had seen in his entire ministry. More broken mothers, more dying boys, more consequences of reckless choices. Whenever he visited her on her lunch breaks, she would say gently, "Gabriel, you're not invincible. Don't let pride dress itself up as courage." He always laughed it off. The truth was painfully simple. Gabriel didn't believe danger could touch him. He believed the altar was untouchable, the sanctuary impenetrable, and his calling a shield stronger than any bullet. He respected the Virgin Mary. He kissed her statue on feast days. He said the rosary when required. But devotion, dependence, surrender, those lived far from his heart. His faith rested on his stamina, his discipline, his refusal to bend, and he had no idea that the very armor he trusted so deeply would soon be shattered. Not by a gang, not by bullets, but by the weight of one innocent life that he could not save. Long before the gunfire tore open the wooden doors of Street Mary of Hope, the universe had tried softly, gently, then urgently to warn Father Gabriel Morales. But warnings rarely arrive as sirens. Most come disguised as conversations, concerns, or uneasy instincts. And Gabriel, armored by years of stubborn courage, brushed aside every single one. The first warning came from someone who loved him enough to be honest. Lucia Morales, his younger sister. She had spent her 20s and 30s in the trauma bay of Freeman Memorial Hospital, where Friday nights felt like a battlefield without uniforms. Teenagers with bullet wounds, mothers screaming in hallways, blood-soaked clothes cut off tiny bodies that had never even learned cursive. When Gabriel visited her during lunch breaks, Lucia's tired eyes always searched his face as if checking for fractures pride kept hidden. "Gabriel," she would say, her voice hoarse after hours, behind a surgical mask. "You're treating yourself like some soldier priest. You're not invincible. No one is." He smiled. Always the same smile, soft, confident, dismissive. "Lucia, I'm exactly where God wants me. Don't worry about me." But she did. She worried constantly. The second warning came from Officer Ryan Cole, a veteran beat cop who always slipped into the Saturday Vigil Mass and sat in the back pew near the candles. Ryan had seen East LA's rhythms changing, tension coiling tighter, retaliations brewing like storms on the horizon. One night after choir practice, he pulled Gabriel aside near the side exit. "Father, listen to me," he began, voice low but urgent. "The saints and the reapers are gearing up for something big. We're hearing chatter about a payback hit. Please tighten security. Lock the doors during Mass if you have to, or at least get volunteers watching the entrances." The request was reasonable. The data was real. The threat was imminent. But Gabriel folded his arms across his chest, chin lifting in that familiar stance of unshakable resolve. "This is a church, Ryan. People come here because they're tired of fearing the world outside. If I close the doors, I teach them fear. That's not what shepherds do." Ryan pressed his lips together, knowing that arguing further would be pointless. "I'm telling you this as a cop," he said quietly, "and as a friend who actually likes you. Don't play with fire." Gabriel only patted his shoulder, a gesture meant to reassure, but one that carried more arrogance than comfort. The third warning came from those who saw the world through the lens of grief. The parish council, a circle of weary mothers, fathers, and grandparents who had lived through losses, too painful to speak lightly about. They met with Gabriel once a month in the parish basement, sipping lukewarm coffee as fluorescent lights hummed overhead. That night, the meeting turned emotional quickly. An elderly woman named Mrs. Delgado, who had buried 2 grandsons in gang-related shootings, stood with trembling hands gripping the edge of the table. "Father, please," she begged, voice cracking. "The children are scared. Families are skipping evening mass. Can we move services earlier? Just until it's safer?" Around her, young mothers nodded, clutching rosaries with white-knuckled fingers. Their eyes were not dramatic. They were exhausted, frightened, sincere. But Gabriel, calm and composed, shook his head. "If we change our schedule because of gangs," he said softly, "we admit they have more power than God, and I cannot do that." Silence fell heavy, suffocating, disappointed. Some felt inspired by his certainty, but others felt their hope collapsing. Still, no one dared press Imam. And then came the final warning, the one he couldn't rationalize away, yet still dismissed. It arrived in the quiet of night, alone in the rectory, when Gabriel dreamed he was standing in the darkened church. The candles were unlit, the pews empty. Only the statue of the Virgin Mary glowed softly in the corner, her eyes wet with tears that slid down her cheeks like drops of sorrow. He woke gasping, heart racing, sweat soaking his collar. But by sunrise he convinced himself it was nothing. A dream, a trick of the mind. He didn't realize it was the last warning he would ever ignore. The moment he stepped into the church that Sunday morning, destiny was already waiting for him, loaded, aimed, and ready to shatter everything he believed about courage, safety, and divine protection. The morning it happened did not arrive with alarms or warnings or anything loud enough to shake Father Gabriel Morales from the certainty he wore like a second skin. Instead, it came wrapped in a strange, unsettling quiet, one so unusual for East Los Angeles that anyone paying attention might have felt a shiver of dread. But Gabriel wasn't paying attention. Not yet. Sundays in the neighborhood usually stirred to life early. Kids bounced basketballs in the alley behind the parish hall. Music thumped from passing cars heading toward brunch spots. Neighbors chatted across balconies, trading jokes and gossip over coffee. Even the stray dogs had a rhythm to their barking. But that Sunday, as Gabriel stepped out of the rectory and locked the door behind him, the block felt hollow. Still, wrong. There were no children playing tag under the bright graffiti murals. No teens skating along the cracked sidewalks. No porch conversations drifting through the air. Only a handful of figures stood on distant corners, young men in hoodies, hands deep in pockets, eyes scanning the street with the restless alertness of predators waiting for a signal. Gabriel slowed for a moment, sensing a weight in the air he couldn't quite name. A chill pricked the back of his neck. Lucia's warnings echoed faintly in his mind. Ryan Cole's voice rose behind it, urging caution, urging awareness. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. But then, as he had done 100 times before, he pushed the feeling away. Fear is weakness, he reminded himself. This is God's house. Nothing will happen here. Inside the church, the atmosphere contrasted so sharply with the eeriness outside that it felt like stepping into another world. Warm, bright light filtered through the stained glass windows. Families filled the pews early, chatting softly as they settled their children. The bilingual choir practiced a gentle Spanish refrain that floated through the sanctuary like a lullaby. This was the Mass everyone loved most, where English and Spanish met in harmony, where cultures blended, where the parish felt like a single family under one roof. Sophie Miller had already arrived with her mother. The 8-year-old with the blue hair bow always chose the front left pew, legs swinging, smile luminous. To her, street. Mary of Hope wasn't just a church. It was the safest place in her world. She often told Gabriel it smelled like heaven. He had laughed the last time she said it. Now, that memory would soon carve itself deeply into the part of his heart that never truly healed. During the opening hymn, Gabriel noticed subtle unease spreading among the congregation. Small gestures at first. A father glancing over his shoulder, an elderly man checking the doors twice, an usher pausing longer than usual near the entrance. It wasn't panic, not yet, but a communal instinct whispering that something outside the church walls was shifting. Then, halfway through the liturgy of the word, a faint pop, pop, pop echoed from somewhere in the distance. Too soft to confirm, too close to ignore. Heads lifted. Conversation stopped. The choir's voices thinned. Gabriel stood still at the ambo, scripture open in his hands, his pulse tightening. He heard the noise. He knew that sound. His childhood had taught him its language well. But pride, the old familiar armor, rose again, urging him to remain calm, to pretend nothing was wrong, to be the shepherd who never flinched. By the time the Mass reached the consecration, the stillness had thickened into fear. Mothers drew their children closer. A few whispered prayers under their breath. Gabriel lifted the host, hands steady but breath unsteady, the incense swirling around him like a warning he refused to acknowledge. And in that fragile moment, as the last chord from the choir drifted into silence, the city outside finally exhaled. Gunfire erupted. Rapid, close, violent. The storm had arrived, no longer hiding behind stillness. And the sanctuary Gabriel believed was untouchable was about to be shattered in the most devastating way. The first volley of gunfire struck the street like a hammer against steel. It rattled the stained glass windows so hard that colored dust drifted from the rafters, shimmering briefly before dissolving into panic. Inside Street. Mary of Hope. The congregation instinctively ducked. Mothers shielded their children with trembling arms. Fathers stretched across pews like human barricades. Even the ushers men who had weathered countless storms in East LA froze, wide-eyed and powerless. But on the altar, Father Gabriel Morales remained standing. The host hovered between his fingers, glowing softly under the candles. Smoke from the incense curled gently upward, as if unaware the world outside had fractured into chaos. Gabriel's breath came shallow, his chest tightening with the realization that everything he had dismissed, every warning, every uneasy instinct, had been right. Yet still, he did not kneel. Not yet. Pride whispered louder than fear. "Stay calm," he called out, voice echoing over the cries. "This is God's house. You're safe." But even he did not believe those words anymore. The gunfire grew louder, closer. Each burst slammed against the church doors like fists demanding entry. A little girl screamed. An elderly man clutched his chest and fell sideways along the pew. Someone yelled, "Call 911," but their phones slipped from their shaking hands. And then the moment arrived. A moment so fast, so violent, the world seemed to snap apart. A single, round, sharp, metallic, fired from less than 30 yards away, struck the main doors of the church. Wood splintered with a sound like a bone breaking. Glass exploded inward in a white-hot shower. Shards sliced through the air, cutting faces, arms, clothing. The bullet tore cleanly through the cloud of smoke. It traveled straight toward the center of Father Gabriel's chest. There was no time for anyone to warn him. No time to scream his name. No time for the priest himself to move. But that was the instant everything changed. 3 different people in the front pew would later swear they saw a flash of blue. Not the cold blue of police lights, but a warm, living radiance, soft at the edges and fierce at the heart. One woman said it resembled a veil unfurling in midair. An elderly man trembling on the floor insisted it looked like a robe billowing forward, as if someone had stepped between the bullet and the priest. A teenage boy said he saw the silhouette of the Virgin Mary, her mantle glowing like a fragment of heaven breaking through the smoke. The security footage captured only a blurred streak of white, but the witnesses swore they saw something more. The bullet struck Father Gabriel's chest. The impact slammed him backward onto the marble steps. His head snapped hard against the stone. The host slipped from his fingers and drifted downward in slow, heartbreaking silence. Gasps rippled through the sanctuary. Someone sobbed uncontrollably. A child cried, "Mommy, is Father okay?" But the miracle that saved the priest came at a terrible, devastating cost. In the chaos that followed, families stampeded toward the aisles. People crawled under pews, shielding their children as debris rained down. Gabriel lay unconscious on the altar steps, breath shallow, blood pooling beneath his cassock. And across the pews, where terrified congregants had thrown themselves to the floor, one cry rose above the others. Angela Miller screamed her daughter's name. "Sophie! Sophie! Baby, get up!" But Sophie Miller, little Sophie with the blue hair bow and the boundless smile, did not answer. In the rush to escape the broken glass and flying debris, a fragment had struck her, a single shard, small but cruel, slicing deep as her mother shielded her with desperate arms. By the time paramedics forced their way inside, Sophie's pulse was fading. Angela held her close, rocking her, whispering prayers through shaking lips. And as Father Gabriel lay breathing but unconscious, saved by a miracle he would not understand for weeks, the child who once said the church smelled like heaven exhaled her final breath in the arms of the woman who loved her most. The priest had lived, but Sophie had not, and that truth would soon destroy the man who believed he feared nothing. When Father Gabriel Morales opened his eyes again, the world was no longer the sanctuary he once believed could never be touched by violence. It was a hospital room, cold lights, pale walls, the distant hum of machines, and a nurse whispering with relief, "You're awake, Father. You're lucky." Lucky. The word tasted like ash. The trauma surgeon explained that the bullet should have torn through Gabriel's heart. It should have killed him instantly. Instead, it struck the small metal scapular hidden beneath his vestments, deflected upward, and lodged itself harmlessly in tissue. A 1 in a million angle, the doctor said. In 23 years, I've never seen anything like it. But Gabriel barely heard him. His memory returned in violent shards, the glass shattering, the flash of blue, the fall, the screams. And then, with a trembling voice, he asked the question he most feared. Is everyone alive? The doctor's silence answered first. Then came the words that crushed him. One child didn't make it. Sophie Miller. Something inside Gabriel broke in a way no surgery could mend. Grief hit him so hard his breath caught. The monitor beeped frantically. His hand flew to his chest, not for the wound, but for the guilt slicing deeper than any bullet could. Sophie, the little girl who believed the church was the safest place she knew. Sophie, who waved to him every Sunday like greeting a superhero. Gone. And Gabriel began to believe a dark lie that settled like poison in his spirit. You should have died instead. 5 days later, upon discharge, he didn't return to Street Mary of Hope. The diocese placed him in a small parish house outside the city, a place meant for recovery, reflection, and rest. But the walls closed in like a prison. Recovery was a word that mocked him. Rest was impossible. The nightmares started immediately. Every night, he relived the moment the church doors exploded. Every night, he saw Sophie's blue bow stained with blood. Every night, he saw the flash of blue. Was it smoke? Was it grace? Was it hallucination? And woke, gasping for air. He stopped praying without making the decision to stop. The word simply no longer came. The collar he once wore with pride now lay untouched on a shelf, as if accusing him. Days blended into nights, nights into whiskey bottles. Lucia called. He ignored her. Officer Ryan knocked. He stayed silent. Letters piled up unopened. Food went stale. Dust gathered over the small statue of the Virgin Mary, sitting on the mantle, her eyes cast downward in sorrow. Gabriel, who once believed he feared nothing, was now afraid of everything. Sound, silence, memories, himself. And then came the night that forced everything to the surface. A storm rolled across the valley with a violence that felt eerily familiar. Rain slammed the windows like fists. Lightning flashed harshly through the curtains. Thunder cracked so loud it shook the entire house, sending Gabriel spiraling back into that morning gunshots. Screams, the bullets streaking toward him. His breath shortened. His hands shook. His chest tightened until every inhale felt like drowning. He stumbled blindly through the dark living room, reaching for something, anything solid. His hand brushed against the wooden crucifix hanging on the wall. The same crucifix he held during late-night prayers in seminary. The same crucifix he abandoned these past weeks. He ripped it from the wall. "Why did you save me?" he shouted, voice cracking under the weight of months of pain. "Why her? She was just a child. She trusted your church. Why her?" He hurled the crucifix across the room. It hit the floor with a violent thud, skidding across the wood until it landed on its side. Christ's face tilted toward him, as though silently waiting. Gabriel pressed both hands to his head, sliding down the wall until he collapsed on the floor, curled like a child hiding from thunder. "I should have died," he whispered. "I should have died." Rain pounded. Thunder roared. And in the chaos of his spirit, something inside him cracked, not in destruction, but in surrender. For the first time in his life, stripped of pride, stripped of strength, stripped of every illusion of control, Father Gabriel whispered 2 trembling words. "Help me." No vision appeared. No voice answered. But somewhere beneath the storm, beneath the guilt, Beneath the wreckage of his soul, a small, fragile opening formed, just wide enough for grace to slip through, and just wide enough for the Virgin Mary to begin her quiet work of healing. 3 weeks passed after the storm, night 3 long, colorless weeks in which Father Gabriel Morales drifted through the days like a ghost inhabiting a body he no longer recognized. He didn't shave. He didn't pray. He didn't answer the door or the phone. He didn't open the blinds. The parish house grew dim and stale, littered with empty bottles and half-eaten meals that never made it to the trash. The crucifix he had thrown in the storm lay on the coffee table, untouched, as though waiting for the moment he'd finally pick up the pieces of his shattered faith. But Gabriel wasn't ready. He wasn't even close. Then, one late afternoon, when the light outside had turned a bruised shade of orange, someone knocked. Not loud, not demanding, just steady, patient, almost gentle. Gabriel froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. He didn't want anyone. Whoever stood on the porch would eventually give up, he told himself. Everyone else had. But the knock came again. He forced himself to stand. His legs trembled. His hands were unsteady as he reached for the doorknob. He opened the door just enough to see who it was, and when he did, the breath left his lungs. Standing on the porch, clutching a small purse with trembling fingers, was Angela Miller, the mother of little Sophie. The woman he feared facing most in the world. She looked smaller than he remembered. Grief had carved hollows beneath her eyes. Her shoulders sagged as though she were carrying the weight of an entire graveyard. But her expression, when she looked at him, wasn't filled with anger. It was something far more devastating. Exhaustion, loneliness, a quiet, broken strength. "Father," she whispered, clearing her throat when her voice cracked. "May I come in?" Gabriel stepped aside numbly. She walked in slowly, taking in the dim living room, the empty bottles, the dust, the unwashed blanket on the couch. Her eyes lingered on the crucifix lying on the table. She understood exactly how it had gotten there. I'm sorry about the mess," Gabriel stammered. Angela, I'm so sorry. About everything." She didn't answer that. Instead, she lowered herself carefully into the chair across from him, hands clasped tightly together as though she feared they might tremble loose. "I came because I need something from you," she said softly. Gabriel's stomach twisted. He braced himself for anger, for accusations he believed he deserved. "Anything," he whispered. "Whatever it is." Angela took a long, trembling breath. "I want you to celebrate Sophie's 6-month memorial, Mass." The room went silent. Gabriel shook his head instantly, almost violently. No, Angela, you don't want me. I failed her. I failed you. My arrogance put your daughter in danger. You should hate me." Angela closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength from somewhere deep and fragile. "I did," she admitted quietly. "At first, I was angry at God, at this neighborhood, at the gangs, at you." A tear slid down her cheek. But anger didn't bring Sophie back, and it didn't heal anything inside me. She looked up, eyes shimmering but steady. "Sophie loved you, Father. She trusted you. She always said you were brave. She would want you there." Gabriel sank to his knees in front of her, something he had never done for anyone outside the confessional. His voice broke as tears spilled onto the floor. "I don't deserve grace," he sobbed. "I don't deserve to stand at an altar ever again." Angela reached forward, hesitant at first, then firm, and placed both hands gently on his face, lifting it until he had to look at her. "Grace isn't deserved," she whispered. "It's given." The words pierced him deeper than any bullet. She rose to leave, pausing at the doorway. "The Mass is in 3 days," she said softly. "We'll be there. I hope you will too." And then she stepped out into the fading light, leaving behind a priest shaking, humbled, breathless, holding, for the first time since the tragedy, a flicker of something that felt like redemption. The 3 days leading up to Sophie Miller's 6-month memorial, Mass passed slowly for Father Gabriel Morales, slow enough for guilt to whisper, fast enough for fear to follow. Yet something fragile had taken root in him after Angela's visit. It wasn't peace. It wasn't confidence. It was simply the willingness to try. And that willingness changed everything. On the first morning, he lifted the blinds for the first time in weeks and let sunlight spill across the room. On the second, he cleaned the house with quiet purpose, throwing away bottles, folding blankets, restoring dignity inch by inch. On the third, he found his cassock in the back of the closet, It was wrinkled, dusty, and carried the faint scent of incense. He didn't put it on yet. Instead, he pressed it to his chest, whispering, 3 days. That night, unable to sleep, Gabriel walked to the mantle where a small statue of the Virgin Mary sat, nearly lost beneath a veil of dust. He lifted her gently, brushing the dust from her mantle as if brushing sorrow from his own heart. I don't know how to pray anymore, he whispered into the quiet. No voice answered, but a soft warmth spread across the bullet scar on his chest, gentle, steady, unmistakably maternal. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough to let him sleep without nightmares for the first time since the shooting. When Sunday arrived, the morning air felt heavier than usual, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Gabriel dressed slowly, hands trembling as he buttoned his cassock. The reflection that greeted him in the mirror startled him older, thinner, humbled, but there was something new in his eyes, surrender. As he approached Street Mary of Hope, he stopped on the steps, frozen. He had once seen this church as a fortress holy and untouchable. Now it looked like a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. The parking lot was already full. Candles flickered by the entrance beside a framed photograph of Sophie and her blue bow. Families gathered quietly, their grief soft but present. And standing by the doors was Angela Miller, hands clasped, waiting. She didn't smile. She simply nodded. It was enough. Inside, the church was packed. People who hadn't returned since the shooting, officers from the police department, children from the school choir, grandparents who had lost loved ones to violence. As Gabriel walked down the aisle, a hush rippled across the pews. Not judgment, not pity, something closer to relief. He reached the altar. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the book of prayers. He closed his eyes and steadied himself. The warmth over his heart returned, faint but reassuring. The Mass began. Gabriel moved slowly, carefully as someone relearning how to walk. When he reached the homily, he set aside his notes. This wasn't a day for preaching. I told myself I was fearless, he began, voice low and trembling. But I was not fearless. I was proud, and my pride cost this community something precious. He swallowed hard. Sophie trusted this church, and I failed to keep her safe. I cannot undo that. But I can stand before you, broken, humbled, and ask for your forgiveness. A ripple of emotion moved through the congregation. A few people sobbed quietly. Angela wiped her eyes but never looked away. And then a woman in the second pew raised her hand. Father, she said, voice unsteady, on the day of the shooting, we saw it. There was a blue light around you, like a mantle, like the Virgin Mary was covering you. Gasps rustled through the pews. Another parishioner stood. I saw it too. A man near the back nodded. The statue moved. I swear it leaned forward. A teenager lifted his hand. My grandma fainted. She said she saw a woman in blue standing between you and the bullet. Testimonies spilled out like water breaking through a dam. Stories people had held in for 6 months, unsure whether they'd be believed or whether the priest was ready to hear them. Gabriel stood motionless, tears welling in his eyes. He hadn't imagined the flash. He hadn't lost his mind. Grace had been there. The Virgin Mary had been there. Angela rose from the front pew, walked to the altar, and took his shaking hand. Father, she said softly, you weren't the only one who needed healing. We all did, and the Virgin Mary didn't let us fall apart. In that moment, the entire church stood not out of ceremony, but out of a shared, trembling truth. They were not healed yet, but for the first time since the tragedy, they were healing together. In the weeks that followed Sophie Miller's memorial mass, something subtle but undeniable shifted at St. Mary of Hope Parish. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't appear in newspapers or trend online. It was quieter than that. Gentler, fragile at first, growing stronger day by day like a candle protected cupped within 2 careful hands. And the first person to feel it was Father Gabriel Morales. He was not healed overnight. Trauma doesn't vanish at the flicker of a miracle. His nightmares still came and went like uninvited visitors. Sudden loud noises still tightened his chest. Some mornings he stared at his cassock, unsure whether he had the strength to put it on. Yet something inside him had changed. He was no longer drowning alone. The community that had once looked to him for courage was now walking beside him, step by step, wound by wound. They prayed with him, grieved with him, laughed shyly with him during awkward first attempts at normalcy. They didn't demand the fearless priest he once pretended to be. They accepted the humbled one he was becoming. At the same time, new traditions took root. Every Thursday evening, the parish began a gathering called the Circle of Mercy, a space where people could speak of what hurt or remain silent if the words were too heavy. There were no lectures, no sermons, just presence. Angela Miller attended every meeting, motherly, quiet, but strong in a way grief had carved, not crushed. When she spoke, heads bowed, not in sorrow, but in reverence. She became a reminder that love and loss could coexist, and that healing was not forgetting, but transforming. A police officer shared that he hadn't stepped into a church since the shooting because he felt guilty for not preventing it. A teenage boy admitted he blamed himself for not pulling Sophie behind the pew fast enough. A grandmother confessed she'd avoided Mass for months because the silence inside the church reminded her of gunfire. And through it all, Gabriel listened, not as a leader above them, but as a brother beside them. He had finally understood something he'd missed for years. Wounds weren't walls. They were windows where God's light entered. One quiet night after the circle of mercy dispersed, Gabriel stayed behind to clean up the candles. The parish hall was empty, bathed in soft gold light. As he walked toward the side chapel, Sophie's favorite place, something stopped him. A scent, faint at first, then unmistakable. Roses, fresh, sweet, impossible. There were no flowers in the chapel that night, no open windows, no breeze. Gabriel stepped inside. The small statue of the Virgin Mary stood beneath a single flickering votive candle. As he approached, a warmth bloomed across his chest, right over the scar where the bullet had struck. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat not his own, like a mother's hand resting gently over a child's wound. He didn't hear a voice. He didn't see a vision. But he understood the message as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. You are not alone. You were never alone. His knees touched the floor before he realized he was kneeling, not in despair, but in gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, for giving me back my life, even the broken parts. Over the next months, his ministry blossomed in ways he never expected. He walked the neighborhood not as a warrior defying the darkness, but as a companion walking with the wounded. He partnered with youth programs, trauma counselors, and local families. Children began returning to the pews. Parents stopped avoiding the windows. Choir voices grew stronger, lifting hymns that felt like stitched prayers. And every night, when he prayed for Sophie by name, it was no longer out of guilt, but out of love. God does not promise a life without wounds, he said in a homily months later. But he promises that no wound is wasted, not one tear, not one scar, not one moment of fear. And sometimes, the greatest miracle isn't being spared from pain, but being transformed by it under the mantle of the Virgin Mary. The church fell silent, not in sorrow, but in awe. They were a community reborn. If this story moved your heart, if you believe the Virgin Mary still protects, heals, and guides us today, then please subscribe to Touched by Light for more real stories of faith, miracles, and transformation. Your support helps us spread hope to the world.